They said he'd never survive the game, until Frank Lucas built an empire worth millions. The streets made him. The Bronx in the 1960s was a place where dreams went to die. Crumbling tenements stretched across neighborhoods like tombstones marking the graves of forgotten ambitions. Frank Lucas was born into this world on September 9, 1930, in La Grange, North Carolina. But it was the streets of Harlem that would truly raise him. The son of a sharecropper's family, Frank learned early that survival meant understanding the rules of a game that had no mercy, no second chances, and no room for the weak. His childhood was marked by poverty and hardship. His parents worked tirelessly, but their efforts barely kept food on the table. Frank watched his father struggle against a system designed to keep men like him perpetually disadvantaged. He saw his mother's hands grow rough from labor, her dreams shrinking with each passing year. By the time Frank was a teenager, he had already made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not accept the limitations that society had placed on him. The streets of Harlem became his classroom. While other boys his age were sitting in school desks, Frank was learning the real curriculum: how to survive, how to hustle, how to navigate a world where the rules were written by those with power and enforced by those with violence. He started small, running numbers, working as a lookout for local drug dealers, doing whatever it took to earn money. The pay was better than any legitimate job available to a young black man in 1950s America, and the respect that came with it was intoxicating. By his early 20s, Frank had caught the attention of Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, one of Harlem's most powerful drug lords. Bumpy saw something in the young man, a combination of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness that was rare. He took Frank under his wing, teaching him not just how to deal drugs, but how to build an organization, how to manage people, and how to think strategically about business. For Frank, this was like receiving a doctorate in street economics. If you're fascinated by stories of ambition and survival against impossible odds, subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will inspire and challenge you. Don't miss a single episode of the most compelling narratives ever told. Frank learned that the drug trade, despite its illegality, operated on the same principles as any legitimate business. You needed supply chains, distribution networks, quality control, and customer loyalty. You needed to manage your workforce, handle your finances, and protect your assets. The only difference was that the stakes were higher, the competition was deadlier, and the law was always closing in. By the late 1960s, Frank Lucas had become a force to be reckoned with in Harlem. But he was still operating within the constraints of the existing drug trade, buying his heroin from Italian mafia suppliers who controlled the supply and set the prices. Frank was making money, yes, but he was also making someone else richer. He began to think bigger, to imagine a different way of doing business. The turning point came when Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Frank was devastated, but he was also liberated. He was no longer content to be anyone's lieutenant. He wanted to be the boss, and he had a plan to get there. While other dealers were scrambling to fill the power vacuum left by Bumpy's death, Frank was thinking about how to revolutionize the entire industry. His genius move was to cut out the middleman. Instead of buying heroin from Italian suppliers, Frank decided to go directly to the source. He traveled to Southeast Asia, to the Golden Triangle region where opium poppies grew in abundance and heroin was produced in clandestine laboratories. He established relationships with local producers and smugglers, creating a supply chain that bypassed the traditional Italian mafia networks entirely. This was revolutionary. By buying directly from producers in Thailand, Frank could get heroin at a fraction of the price that the Italian mafia was charging. He could then sell it on the streets of Harlem at competitive prices while maintaining profit margins that were astronomical. His product was purer, cheaper, and more abundant than anything else available in the market. Within a few years, Frank Lucas had become the dominant heroin dealer in Harlem, and his operation was generating millions of dollars in revenue. Frank's business model was built on several key principles. First, he maintained strict quality control. His heroin was consistently pure and reliable, which meant that addicts knew exactly what they were getting when they bought from his organization. This reliability built customer loyalty in a market where purity could vary wildly from dealer to dealer. Second, he was willing to undercut his competitors on price, using his superior supply chain to offer better deals. Third, he invested heavily in his distribution network, ensuring that his product was available on every corner in Harlem. But Frank understood that running a successful criminal enterprise required more than just good business practices. It required respect, fear, and an iron-fisted management style. He surrounded himself with loyal lieutenants, many of them family members. He paid them well, but he also made it clear that betrayal would be met with swift and brutal punishment. Stories of what happened to those who crossed Frank Lucas spread through the streets of Harlem, and they served as a powerful deterrent to disloyalty. If you're impressed by Frank Lucas's strategic thinking and business acumen, even in the context of illegal activities, please like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you these fascinating stories of ambition and power. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas was living a lifestyle that seemed impossible for a man who had grown up in poverty. He owned multiple properties, drove expensive cars, wore custom-made suits, and surrounded himself with beautiful women. He had achieved the American dream, albeit through means that were decidedly illegal. But more importantly, he had proven that a poor black man from the streets could build an empire that rivaled those of the most powerful crime bosses in the country. The early 1970s represented the zenith of Frank Lucas's power and influence. His heroin operation was generating an estimated $1 million per day in revenue. He had transformed Harlem into his personal fiefdom, and his name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect on every street corner. But Frank was not content to simply be a drug dealer. He wanted to be a businessman, a philanthropist, and a respected member of the community. Frank began to invest his drug money into legitimate businesses. He bought real estate, opened nightclubs, and invested in restaurants. He wanted to create a veneer of legitimacy that would allow him to move through society without constantly looking over his shoulder. He also began to give back to the community, sponsoring youth programs and helping families in need. In his mind, he was a Robin Hood figure, taking from the system that had oppressed his people and redistributing wealth to those who had been left behind. His personal life reflected his newfound wealth and status. Frank married Juliana Farrate, a Puerto Rican woman from a wealthy family, in 1967. Juliana was beautiful, intelligent, and came from money, which gave Frank a connection to a world beyond the streets. Together, they lived in a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, far from the chaos of Harlem. They had children, and Frank was determined to provide them with the kind of life he had never had: private schools, travel, and opportunities. Frank's style was legendary. He wore custom-made suits from the finest tailors, drove a Cadillac with a license plate that read Drug King, and wore jewelry that cost more than most people's houses. He was flashy, confident, and seemingly untouchable. The police knew who he was, but they couldn't seem to catch him. He had connections in the police department, judges who looked the other way, and an organization that was so efficient and well-run that it seemed to operate with impunity. But success in the drug trade always comes with a price. As Frank's operation grew larger and more profitable, it also became more visible. The sheer volume of heroin flowing through Harlem was impossible to hide. Addicts were dying from overdoses at alarming rates. Families were being destroyed. The social fabric of the community was unraveling, and the federal government was taking notice. The DEA, the FBI, and local law enforcement agencies were all focused on bringing down Frank Lucas. They knew that if they could take him down, they could dismantle the entire heroin distribution network in Harlem. But Frank was careful, methodical, and always one step ahead. He used coded language, conducted business in person rather than over the phone, and constantly changed his routines to avoid establishing patterns that law enforcement could exploit. What do you think about Frank Lucas's rise to power? Do you see him as a criminal mastermind or a victim of circumstance? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this complex and controversial figure. Frank also understood the importance of maintaining his image and his reputation. He was generous with his money, throwing lavish parties and sponsoring community events. He was known for helping people in need, paying for funerals, and providing financial assistance to families struggling to survive. This generosity earned him a certain amount of goodwill in the community, which made it harder for law enforcement to get people to cooperate against him. However, cracks were beginning to form in Frank's empire. His younger brother, Alpo Martinez, was becoming increasingly ambitious and violent. Other dealers were growing tired of Frank's dominance and were looking for ways to challenge his authority. The heroin market was becoming more competitive, with new players entering the game and established dealers fighting for market share. And the federal government's investigation into Frank's activities was intensifying. The beginning of the end came in 1975 when federal agents began a massive investigation into Frank Lucas's drug operation. They used wiretaps, informants, and surveillance to build a case against him. They followed his money, traced his supply lines, and documented his transactions. Slowly but surely, they were building an airtight case that would be impossible to defend against. Frank's downfall was accelerated by betrayal from within his own organization. Several of his associates, facing lengthy prison sentences, decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. They provided detailed testimony about Frank's operations, his methods, and his connections. They revealed the names of corrupt police officers and judges who had been protecting him. The walls were closing in. In January 1975, federal agents arrested Frank Lucas at his home in Teaneck, New Jersey. The arrest was dramatic and public, designed to send a message that no one was above the law. Frank was charged with drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors had documented his drug operation in meticulous detail, and they had witnesses who could testify to his involvement. Frank's trial was a sensation. The media covered it extensively, and the public was fascinated by the story of a poor black man who had built a multi-million-dollar drug empire. Some saw him as a criminal who deserved to be punished. Others saw him as a victim of a system that had failed him, a man who had simply taken advantage of the opportunities available to him in a world that had closed all legitimate doors. In 1976, Frank Lucas was convicted and sentenced to 70 years in prison. It seemed like the end of his story. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his empire dismantled, his freedom taken away. But Frank had one more card to play. While in prison, Frank made a decision that would shock many people. He decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors and provide testimony against the corrupt police officers and judges who had been protecting him. This cooperation came at a great personal cost. He was putting himself in danger by testifying against powerful people who had connections both inside and outside the prison system. But Frank believed that it was the right thing to do. His cooperation led to the conviction of several corrupt law enforcement officials and judges. It also resulted in a significant reduction in his sentence. Instead of serving 70 years, Frank was eventually released from prison after serving approximately 15 years. When he was released, he was a changed man. He had spent years in prison, away from his family, away from the life he had built. He had time to reflect on his choices and their consequences. If you want to hear more stories about how powerful figures have fallen from grace and found redemption, subscribe to our channel now. We bring you the most compelling narratives of transformation and change that will keep you coming back for more. After his release from prison, Frank Lucas attempted to rebuild his life. He was no longer the flashy drug kingpin who had dominated Harlem in the 1970s. He was an older man, marked by his years in prison, trying to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. He worked legitimate jobs, lived a relatively quiet life, and tried to distance himself from his criminal past. Frank's story gained renewed attention in 2007 when the film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington, was released. The movie dramatized Frank's rise and fall, bringing his story to a new generation of viewers. Some criticized the film for glorifying Frank's criminal activities, while others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the drug trade. Frank himself was involved in the production of the film, serving as a consultant and helping to ensure that the story was told accurately. In his later years, Frank Lucas became something of a celebrity. He gave interviews, appeared at speaking engagements, and wrote a memoir. He spoke about his experiences in the drug trade, the consequences of his actions, and the lessons he had learned. He became an advocate for youth programs and community development, using his story as a cautionary tale to discourage young people from following in his footsteps. Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019, at the age of 88. His death marked the end of an era in American crime history. He had lived through the rise and fall of the heroin trade in Harlem, had built an empire worth millions, and had ultimately paid the price for his crimes. But his legacy was more complex than simply being a drug dealer. He was a man who had overcome poverty and discrimination to achieve success, albeit through illegal means. He was a man who had ultimately chosen redemption over continued criminality. The story of Frank Lucas raises important questions about crime, poverty, opportunity, and the American dream. It asks us to consider what drives people to pursue illegal activities, what circumstances lead to the rise of criminal enterprises, and what it takes for someone to turn their life around. It challenges us to think about the systemic inequalities that create the conditions for crime to flourish and the importance of providing legitimate opportunities for people to succeed. Frank Lucas's empire was built on the suffering of countless addicts and the destruction of families and communities. His wealth came at an enormous social cost. But his story also demonstrates the intelligence, ambition, and business acumen that could have made him successful in the legitimate business world if he had been given the opportunity. It's a tragic story of wasted potential, but also a story of resilience and the possibility of redemption. What did you think of Frank Lucas's journey from poverty to power and ultimately to redemption? Like this video if you found his story compelling, and leave a comment below telling us what aspect of his life you found most interesting. Your engagement helps us create more content like this, so thank you for being part of our community. The story of Frank Lucas is one of the most fascinating and complex narratives in American crime history. It's a story about ambition, intelligence, and the pursuit of success in a world that seemed designed to prevent people like him from achieving it. It's a story about the consequences of choosing illegal paths to wealth and power, and the ultimate price that must be paid. But it's also a story about redemption, about the possibility of change, and about the human capacity to reflect on past mistakes and attempt to make amends. Frank Lucas proved that a man born into poverty and discrimination could build an empire worth millions. He demonstrated business acumen, strategic thinking, and organizational skills that would have made him successful in any field. But he also demonstrated the dangers of pursuing wealth and power through illegal means and the inevitable consequences that follow. His story serves as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, reminding us that true success must be built on a foundation of integrity and respect for others. Today, Frank Lucas is remembered not just as a drug kingpin, but as a complex figure whose life story encompasses themes of ambition, crime, punishment, and redemption. His legacy continues to fascinate researchers, filmmakers, and the general public, ensuring that his story will be told and retold for generations to come. Whether viewed as a criminal mastermind or a victim of circumstance, Frank Lucas's impact on American culture and history is undeniable.